Now, if I mention the model Pontiac Tempest, many people will have an image in their mind, a vehicle that looks like what you see here in this illustration, the Tempest Custom for 1966. And what a beautiful illustration that is, done by Art Fitzpatrick and Van Kaufman. Looks like it's on the shoreline in Hawaii there with the beautiful waves and then a lady in a hammock between the palm trees. I need my 66 Tempest in that particular location. And the Tempest was a pretty cool car from Pontiac, I have to say. It kind of gets overshadowed by the GTO, which was effectively a Tempest with a big 389 cubic inch V8 underhood. But the Tempest did have some awesome powertrains over the years, including the a 389 four-cylinder engine, the 194.5 cubic inch, huge four-cylinder engine underhood when the Tempest debuted for its inaugural 1961 model year. And then in later years, like 1966 that you see here, they could even be equipped with an overhead cam six-cylinder engine, a belt-driven overhead cam six-cylinder engine as well. So Tempests, I think, were pretty awesome vehicles from a Pontiac standpoint. They also tended to have a level of artistic beauty, like this 1961 Tempest that brought back the split grille look from the 1959 full-size Pontiacs here in a senior compact size automobile, as General Motors called it. Take a look at the sculpture on this and the body side surfacing. It's pretty complicated with this kind of out, in type surfacing that gives that body side just some beautiful depth and dimension that you really don't see today. And this car has a huge shoulder around it. Look at the distance from the window glass to the outer edge of the door. Again, something you just don't see today. That would have impinged on interior space, and I guess, well, we can't have too much style nowadays. We have to have a lot of function in our vehicles. But did you know that there was a Pontiac Tempest that was produced from 1987 to 1991? Pontiac Tempest, you say, produced from 1987 to 1991? No, there was not. And I must reply, yes, there was. Take a look and feast your eyes upon this beautiful, car. No, that is not a Chevrolet Corsica that you're looking at. This is a Pontiac Tempest. If you look closely, you can see the Tempest badging on the front door, and you can also see the Pontiac arrowhead at the front of the vehicle. And this car has different cladding, or multicolored cladding, let's say, too, here, and a different grille than the Chevrolet Corsica. What the heck is going on here? Where was this thing sold? Well, this was a highly popular vehicle, particularly in one market outside the United States, namely Canada. Yes, these Pontiac Tempests were sold in Canada from 1987 to 1991. And during that time, you could buy yourself a Chevrolet Corsica by another name, in effect. Now, before the Corsica lovers start hating on me, let's just pause for a second. This is not an ugly car. It's kind of an inoffensive car, if that's an appropriate adjective for it. It's not necessarily dramatic, but it's well styled. It has this sheer look and certainly has a pronounced body side crease that runs the length of the car to give that side a little bit of dimension. But it's not as dramatically styled as what you saw the 61 or 66 Tempest that preceded it. Now, as we transition to this dead-on front view, you can see the license plate on this Pontiac Tempest says beautiful British Columbia. Hence what I'm talking about. This vehicle was sold in Canada. And that kind of begs the question, why in the world would General Motors have this vehicle that was not sold in the U.S. and was sold in Canada instead? Why would they introduce the Pontiac Tempest there? Well, for many, many years, actually all the way until the brand was sunset, the Pontiac nameplate in Canada was actually the dominant brand, not Chevrolet. Pontiac far outsold Chevrolet, and even GMC, I believe, still outsells Chevrolet when it comes to trucks in Canada. And the Pontiac brand just has a long, storied history in Canada. In Canada, Chevrolets were kind of viewed as a box with four wheels, the ultimate in bargain basement vehicles. But if you wanted a nice, respectable automobile that anybody could drive, from a doctor to somebody who was working in a factory, it was a Pontiac. And of course, there were different levels of Pontiacs over the years. Well before this 87 to 91 Pontiac Tempest, there was the Stratochief, the Laurentian, the Parisian being the upper end. In some years, there was the Grand Parisian. But Pontiac was always viewed as something that was a little bit more special than the Chevrolet, and it was. They were nicer, although in many years through those mid-1970s or so, the Pontiacs that were made in Canada and sold in Canada were different from those in the U.S. More specifically, they used Chevrolet chassis and drivetrains. So if you got a 1972 Pontiac Parisienne, for example, you actually got a Chevrolet drivetrain, like a Chevrolet 350 cubic inch V8 underhood in your Pontiac Parisienne. And that was just fine. The cars worked beautifully. I have a 1959 Pontiac Parisienne that is not a wide track Pontiac. It's a narrow track Pontiac because it has a Chevrolet Impala frame underneath it and suspension and brakes and everything, and a 261 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine. And I got to say, the car works brilliantly. You really don't miss anything. It'd be nice if it had a few more horsepower, but it's got plenty of torque, beautifully smooth 6-cylinder engine, so you really don't miss the power. And back in the day, in Canada especially, you weren't driving 70, 80 miles an hour. There was no expressway. You were at most going kind of 55 down the road, maybe 60 tops. But I digress. Back to this fine specimen of a Chevrolet Corsica, Pontiac Tempest, I mean. And you can see from the rear three-quarter view here, it's basically Chevrolet Corsica. The taillight design is the same. The badging out back, it does say Pontiac Tempest. Woohoo! But, these cars, like I said, were inoffensively styled. They don't look too bad. They kind of resemble, to me, the Saturn prototypes before the Saturn design went in a different direction. And, the car was trying to compete with Japanese imports, which also were pretty blandly styled at the time. And that's what I think GM was trying to go for. Very glassy upper, low belt line, lots of area to see out. Look how big that backlight is. I mean, it goes all the way into the roof. It's tremendously huge. You don't see that anymore. And the designers tried to do a few little tricks with the blacked out B-pillar trim to make it look like it's a little bit of a pillarless car. Well, not overly convincing. And it does have the rear quarter glass, too. But let's turn to the interior, because these early Corsicas and Tempests actually had a little bit of an avant-garde interior for such a, let's just say, normal-looking exterior. You can see you've got this full-length rib design that the air vents are integrated into on the instrument panel. I thought that was kind of cool. It was a neat look. Gave you this shelf where you could put your pencils and pens, and they would slide around back and forth. There are little divider strips there that you can see in between different portions of that parcel shelf, I guess I'll call it. But you really couldn't put much there because those dividers are spaced far apart, so things are going to slide around. And, of course, it wouldn't be safe in the event of a crash. I do enjoy these to have little directional controls where you can control the airflow of those air vents, moving it left to right. But usually on these cars, they were made of such high quality that they squeaked and kind of would go ee as you moved it back and forth. I mean, it was a Chevrolet / Pontiac after all. This one's also a bit later designed because it has the Beretta wiper control as opposed to a rotary knob that the earliest ones had. So, yeah, I thought it was kind of a cool interior theme overall. The materials weren't necessarily the best. But again, this was a low-end family car, and there was lots of room on the inside. These were roomy for the time frame. That was one thing that GM definitely did well back in the day, was packaging. And most of their cars that were relatively small had good interior space. Now, one thing that this car has, and that can be the subject of a different video, is it has the seat belts on the doors on this particular model, and that was true for many GM vehicles during this time frame. There was a federal motor vehicle safety standard that required some sort of a passive belt. In other words, you either had to have an airbag in the car that would restrain you passively in the event of being unbuckled, or you had to have a seatbelt setup that would automatically buckle, at least partially. And that's why you got a lot of those cars with the motorized belts. And GM came up with this design of putting the seatbelt in the door. And the idea was that you could leave the seatbelt buckled the entire time. You would just kind of pick up the belt as you entered the vehicle. It was a terrible design. Of course, if you got in a crash, the door opens. Well, now you're no longer belted. So that wasn't a great idea. But we will leave that as a subject for another day, the passive restraint design on this generation of GM vehicles. I think GM was the only one that did something similar, and they did that so they didn't have to put a motorized belt in or have an airbag. And of course, just a few years later, airbags would be in place on the driver's side in the early 1990s. And so that seatbelt design went away. And again, as GM realized that in some crashes, the doors would pop open, well, you want to keep people belted in that event. So not a great design. It was ugly too. And if you rolled the window down and you're going relatively fast, it'd create a wind whistle. It just was not good. But what was good, the 1987 to 1991 Pontiac Tempest. Ooh, pretty sweet Pontiac. Maybe the best Pontiac of all time, right? Or maybe not. Well, put a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching.